Hey guys, in this video we're going to learn about the ventricles. These are spaces inside the brain where cerebrospinal fluid is found. So here are slides from our lecture PowerPoint, and let's take a look at some information and some pictures about the ventricles, the spaces for cerebrospinal fluid that are inside the brain. So here's a picture of the brain, and we're looking anterior to posterior. So the front of the brain is here, and the back will be back here. And here's the left and the right sides. So let's take a look at these blue structures. So these are your ventricles. So it's very important to remember that ventricles are spaces. They are compartments that are filled with your cerebrospinal fluid, your CSF. And remember, the ventricles are lined by these ependymal cells, the cells which are going to be making and circulating the cerebrospinal fluid. So let's see if we can get the names of some of these ventricles. So first of all, you have 1 and 2 lateral ventricles. So these lateral ventricles are very large structures, and we'll see them from the side in a moment as well. And they have a very distinctive shape. If your CSF is made by your choroid plexus up top here or underneath your lateral ventricle, that CSF is going to drop into the lateral ventricle. So you have 2 lateral ventricles, and they are connected by the interventricular foramen, these little tubes right here, or these little holes, down to the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is here, and it's right next to the thalamus, and it's all around the intermediate mass of the thalamus. So here's your third ventricle of the brain. And then down here next to the cerebellum, in between the cerebellum and the pons, that's where you find your fourth ventricle. And there is a channel here that connects the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle. Is called the cerebral aqueduct. So we have 2 lateral ventricles, a third ventricle, and a fourth ventricle. And the interventricular foramens connect the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Now you'll notice when you're down here at the fourth ventricle, you've got these lateral apertures. These are allowing the CSF to come out into the subarachnoid space and allowing it to circulate around the outside of the brain like that. Also, you'll notice that the fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. That central canal is a little hole that's in the very middle of your spinal cord, and CSF is found in there as well. So this just takes you through each of the ventricle names and tells you a little bit about them. So remember, we have 2 lateral ventricles. There's a left one and a right one, and they're separated from each other by a thin membrane that's called the septum pellucidum. Now, to connect the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, the fluid needs to pass through this hole called the interventricular foramen. So you have an interventricular foramen connecting the right lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. You have an interventricular foramen connecting the left lateral ventricle to the third ventricle. And then, like I said, the third ventricle is all around the thalamus, and it's all around the intermediate mass of the thalamus. So it's right in the center of the brain. And then the third ventricle is connected to the fourth ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct, this channel that passes through the midbrain part of the brain. And then remember, the fourth ventricle is in between the pons and the medulla. So here you can see the ventricles again. This is the picture we just saw previously, but here's what it looks like from the side, from the lateral view. So here, all of this guy right here, that entire kind of backwards C-shaped structure right there, that is all lateral ventricles. So it's a really big compartment for your CSF. And then here's your third ventricle right here. And why does it have this hole in the middle? This is where the intermediate mass of the thalamus, the structure that connects the left side of the thalamus to the right side of the thalamus, passes through that hole. So there has to be a space here for that intermediate mass structure to have somewhere to be. And then down here, in between your cerebellum, which is here, and your pons, which is here, you've got your fourth ventricle. And here's the cerebral aqueduct connecting the third ventricle down to the fourth ventricle. So it looks a little different whether you see it from the side or whether you see it from the front. So in our next video, we're going to learn how the CSF circulates and what happens after it leaves at the lateral apertures of the fourth ventricle.